The Wreck of the Transcon by Jeff S. Assay. At dawn on September 26, 1946, 5 men gathered on the platform at Yermo, California for the arrival of the westbound Transcon Union Pacific Passenger Train number 3. These men were engineer Pearl S. Parker, 63, fireman Richard J. Zettelmeyer, age unknown, and car inspectors Robert S. Critcher, 41, and Jesse May, 30. On this morning, clear and cool, but promising heat later, the Transcon would arrive on time and depart late. And from this unfortunate beginning, things would shortly get worse. Much worse. A headlight appeared in the east as daylight came to this small high desert railroad community. Soon the Transcon drifted along the platform and was spotted to a stop by Foreman Davis. The train had just completed a 3-hour, 45-minute non-stop run from Las Vegas. It was 5:50 a.m., and the train was exactly on time. It was scheduled to depart at 6 a.m. sharp. The locomotive pulling the Transcon on this morning was number 835, one of UP's nearly new 800 class FEF Northerns. There were 11 cars behind the 835's tender, a baggage car, 3 coaches, 2 diners, and 5 Pullman sleepers. Davis's first responsibility that morning was to fill the 835's tender with both water and fuel oil, and after that to make a general inspection of the locomotive. The incoming engineer and fireman, who played no part in later events and whose names have been lost, reported nothing unusual about the engine or the train. Davis climbed to the top of the tender and began to add fuel oil. Fireman Zettelmeyer joined him to help with the water spout. The standing instructions at Yermo were to add oil to the tender to a level of 72 to 75 inches, with about 84 inches, or 6,000 gallons being a full tank, and to take on a full tank of water, 23,000 gallons. This would allow the engine to run into Los Angeles without adding more oil and with only one more stop for water at San Bernardino. Zettelmeyer returned to the cab to check the boiler, injectors, and firing valve. Davis climbed back down to the ground and joined Parker to inspect the locomotive. They found nothing amiss with the 835 on this morning. The men then climbed into the cab and checked the firebox, boiler, steam lines, brake valves, air gauges, firing valve, injectors, and anything else that could be a problem. This was nothing out of line that morning. About this time, train conductor Joseph Murphy, 58, came to the head end and talked to Parker about the run to Los Angeles. Train crews on this run worked from Las Vegas to Los Angeles and did not change at Yermo like the engineer and fireman. Parker and Murphy compared watches and exchanged pleasantries, and Murphy returned to the train. Parker returned to the cab to make the required brake tests and get ready for the highball to depart. Earlier, as the Transcon had eased to a stop, the 2 car inspectors prepared to walk the train to check the brake system. Critcher drifted toward the rear of the train. When he reached the end of the last car, a sleeper, he hung his blue flag and light and installed a tattletale hose on the train and signal airlines. The tattletale gauge confirmed train line pressure at 90 pounds, reflecting the required 20 pounds set by the incoming engineer. The signal line was proper at 50 pounds. Critcher then walked forward on the fireman's side, inspecting piston travel on each car and the condition of the brake shoes and rigging. May, the other car inspector, hung his blue flag and light on the engineer's side of 835's cab and proceeded to walk toward the rear, also inspecting piston travel, shoes, and rigging. When Critcher reached the first car with an open vestibule, which would usually be the last coach in the consist since the Pullmans and diners were never opened at Yermo, he signaled the engineer to release the train brakes. Parker duly released the train brakes as instructed. Critcher then returned to the platform to continue his inspection. Critcher and May continued inspecting their respective sides of the train, now verifying that all the brakes had released. When May reached the rear car, he checked that train line pressure was once again 110 pounds as required for passenger trains. He signaled Parker on the communication line that the train brakes were working properly and removed the tattletale and blue flag and light. Critcher finished his inspection of the train and also removed the blue flag and light from the 835. With the inspections finished, the tender filled with oil and water, and the blue flags removed, Parker had only to await the highball from Murphy to start the Transcon on its way to Los Angeles. The highball did not come until 6:05 a.m. Parker released the engine brakes and eased back on the 835's throttle. He took the Transcon down to Daggett, making a running air test as required, and entered Santa Fe's double-track main line. What he didn't know as he pulled out of Yermo on the morning of September 26th was that in exactly 1 hour, things would not go well at all. In fact, things would be very, very bad. 6 people would be dead. Scores would be injured. Most of the Transcon would be spread across the right-of-way. The 835 would be on its side, and Parker's long career as an engineer for Union Pacific Railroad would be over. The history of the Transcon. The Transcon was one of new passenger trains that UP had inaugurated on June 2nd, 1946, as part of the general restructuring of train service nationwide. Most of the railroads in the country, including UP, converted over to peacetime passenger operations on that date. In the new scheme, the Transcon was slotted as the mid-level train on the Chicago to Los Angeles run. The premier train was, of course, the extra fare tri-weekly Streamliner City to Los Angeles, followed in the pecking order by the daily Los Angeles Limited. The old school train, which had traditionally been all Pullman, but which now carried a couple of coaches as well. The Transcon apparently was something of a hybrid, having characteristics of both the Limited and the City. It carried old line heavyweight Pullmans and diners and the newer so-called lightweight coaches. It seemed to be aimed at business travelers and at passengers who didn't want or need the traditional luxuries of lounges, observations, and club cars. Its main claim to fame, though, was that it carried 2 through Pullmans from New York City, one on the NYC and one via the PRR. This was UP's post-war attempt to capture some of the transcontinental market. After the Transcon passengers had a choice of the tourist-class Challenger or the very old-school Pony Express Pacific, which carried standard heavyweight coaches and sleepers. For those who preferred even slower siding-to-siding service, the unnamed, not otherwise specified 43 and 44 also carried coaches and sleepers on the Omaha to Los Angeles run. All trains carried dining cars. The Transcon in particular carried 2 diners, one for the Pullman passengers and one for the coaches. The Transcon, numbered as trains 3 to 4 in UP's time card but identified as 223 and 224 on the Santa Fe due to schedule number conflicts, operated on a 47.5-hour schedule westbound from Chicago to Los Angeles and a 50-hour schedule eastbound from Los Angeles. This scheduling required 2 nights in each direction. Basically, the trains departed Chicago and LA in mid-morning and arrived at destination in mid to late morning on the second day. The New York through Pullman tacked on another night in each direction. Number 3 was carted to arrive at Los Angeles Union Passenger Terminal at 10:20 a.m., following a 4-hour, 20-minute run from Yermo. Scheduled stops were at Barstow, San Bernardino, Riverside, and East Los Angeles. If necessary, flag stops would be made at Ontario and Pomona. The distance between Yermo and LAUPT was 165 miles, requiring an average overall speed of 37 miles per hour to meet the schedule. This was not an especially fast running time, and the schedule could easily be achieved if the station stops were handled efficiently. If the need arose, an experienced and careful hoghead could get us as much as 10 minutes back on the run and maybe 15 on occasion. But the key was patience. Parker was still 5 minutes late when he brought the Transcon to a stop at Barstow. The stop itself did not go well, and there was more delay leaving the Barstow depot tracks. Parker was 9 minutes behind schedule when he cleared yard limits and now had his work cut out for him. Engineer Pearl S. Parker of Temple City, California, was the perfect example of an old-timer, a hoghead who had been around since railroads were invented. Or so it seemed. Born in 1883 in Branson, Kansas, he had hired on as a machinist helper in Los Angeles in August 1905, just 3 months after the line of the San Pedro, Los Angeles and Salt Lake Railroad had been completed. He became a fireman a year later and was promoted to the right-hand seat box in 1911. Parker's disciplinary record was not exemplary, but he had never been involved in a major accident. Parker's dilemma on the morning of September 26th as he highballed out of Barstow was how to get the Transcon back on time without endangering the train. On the Santa Fe, whose rules governed the operation of UP trains on the Daggett-Riverside Junction joint track, passenger train engineers were required to run to schedule as listed in the employee timetable while observing all curve speed reductions. In addition to schedule speeds, Santa Fe also set maximum train speeds. The maximum allowable passenger train speed on Santa Fe's Los Angeles Division main lines, as listed in employees' timetables number 127, dated June 2, 1946, was 100 miles per hour. However, UP passenger trains powered by 800 class steam locomotives were held to a maximum speed of 90 miles per hour. UP diesels were also restricted to 90 miles per hour, while the 7850 class Mountains were limited to 70 miles per hour. Parker routinely operated all three classes of power on the Transcon assignment. The Santa Fe timetable also included Special Rule 26. This rule permitted engineers to exceed schedule speeds if necessary to make meeting points or connections, but only if the conductor was consulted and agreed with the plan. The rule did not apply to maximum locomotive speeds nor to speed restrictions on curves. As Parker was well aware, there was no similar special rule on Union Pacific's lines. In fact, the maximum speed of the Transcon with 800 class power on the first subdivision between Riverside and Los Angeles was only 75 miles per hour, 15 miles per hour slower than on the Santa Fe. Parker knew the difference between Santa Fe and UP rules because he had been reprimanded 2 weeks earlier for running the Transcon at 84 miles per hour with an 800 class locomotive between Walnut and Bartolo, 9 miles per hour above the maximum permitted passenger train speed on the first sub. So given the higher speeds on the Santa Fe, the fact that the Transcon made no stops until San Bernardino, and the existence of Special Rule 26, Parker probably figured that his best chance to get the 9 minutes back would be to run as close to 90 miles per hour as he could between Barstow and Summit. There were two restricted curves just east of Victorville that could be trouble though. The first, at Oro Grande, called for a 60 mile per hour maximum, although Santa Fe engineers were known to take it somewhat higher. The real problem was Curve 28, located at the entrance to Milepost 34 between Oro Grande and Victorville. Curve 28 was a 6-degree right-hand curve with 3.5 inches of super elevation wedged in between the Mojave River and an outcropping of rock. It was not only the sharpest curve on the joint track, but the entering spiral for westbound trains was also shorter than normal due to the restricting topography. Curve 28, therefore, was restricted to 40 miles per hour for westbound passenger trains, and every Santa Fe and Union Pacific engineer, including Parker, knew that 40 miles per hour meant 40 miles per hour in this case. Parker would have to slow his train from 90 miles per hour to 60 miles per hour at Oro Grande, and then to 40 miles per hour to negotiate this curve. There would be no forgiveness here. There was a problem though. The 835 was not equipped with a speedometer. The 835 had been built by the American Locomotive Company in December 1944, part of the last order for steam engines ever placed by Union Pacific. It was a 484 Northern type steam engine joined to a semi-Vanderbilt tender having a leading 4-wheel truck followed by 5 pairs of wheels and pedestals that were integral to the tender bed. It was delivered as a coal burner and later converted to fuel oil. The total weight of the engine was 486,340 pounds, or some 243 tons. The total weight of the engine was 486,340 pounds, or some 243 tons. 835's working boiler pressure was 300 pounds. The tender held 23,500 gallons of water and 6,000 gallons of fuel oil. It weighed 421,550 pounds when full. Together, the engine and loaded tender weighed 907,890 pounds. The engine and tender were 114 feet, 2 5/8 inches long over coupler faces. The combination was designed to negotiate a 20-degree curve without difficulty. The 835 would easily handle a 6-degree curve. The question was at what speed. The 2 engine trucks and tender truck were equipped with rack-type lateral resistance devices, and the first 3 pairs of 80-inch driving wheels were equipped with Alco lateral cushioning devices. Only the 4th pair of drivers was fixed in the frame. All drivers and engine trucks were fitted with roller bearings. The same was true for the tender and the pedestal wheels. According to information supplied at the accident investigation by David S. Newhart, UP's Assistant General Superintendent of Motive Power, the 835 had run a total of 313,552 miles since delivery. Following the last major shopping for Class 3 repairs at Omaha in May 1946, the locomotive had run 71,157 miles. In round numbers, the engine was running 15,000 miles a month. The first 800 class locomotive had run to Los Angeles in April 1946. The first record of 835 coming into Los Angeles was on August 2nd. It returned on August 18th and again on September 7th, 11th, and 17th. Apparently, more 800s were assigned to the South Central District beginning in September. Parker himself ran 800 class locomotives into Los Angeles on the Transcon on 19 occasions in September prior to the accident. The 835 was a modern, well-designed, and well-built steam locomotive that was fast becoming obsolete less than 2 years after delivery. UP was putting the miles on it to recover its investment. There was no downtime for this locomotive. However modern they might have been, there was one drawback to the 800 class, and to the 835 in particular. They were not equipped with speedometers or speed recorders. Derailment. As Parker highballed out of Barstow, the events that would lead to disaster began to click into place. After making the required running brake test and clearing yard limits, Parker hauled 835's throttle lever back to the 3/4 position as far as it was usually extended. This engaged all 5 valves in the throttle assembly and gave the cylinders as much superheated steam as they could handle. He notched the reverser lever back to 35% cutoff as it was typical for these locomotives running at high speed. The Transcon soon reached and exceeded the 90-mile-per-hour limit on the straight and level track south of Barstow. The sight of the 835 hauling 11 cars through the high desert that morning at better than 90 miles per hour must have been something to behold. In other words, Parker was flat out running as fast as he could. Whether he knew how fast he was running is open to conjecture. He didn't think his speed was excessive, he testified at the investigation, but he had no way of knowing for certain. Parker didn't complain about the lack of speedometer on the 835. His pride wouldn't let him do it. He was certain he could judge train speed by the seat of his pants just as he always did. However, his rear brakeman, Louis E. Roy, 41, was required by Santa Fe rules to record the time the train passed each station on Form 875, Flagman's Trip reported for passenger trains. This form would be mailed to the Santa Fe trainmaster in San Bernardino every morning at the end of the run. Roy checked the time and made the notations on the form that morning, up until the accident, when he stuffed the form into his vest pocket. According to Brakeman Roy's times, Parker attained an average speed of over 90 miles per hour between Hodge and Helendale, taking 6 minutes to go 9.3 miles. According to Brakeman Roy's times, Parker attained an average speed of over 90 miles per hour between Hodge and Helendale, taking 6 minutes to go 9.3 miles, 1.55 miles per minute, or about 40 seconds to the mile. Between Helendale and Bryman, Parker covered 5 miles in 3 minutes, a speed of 100 miles per hour. Then between Bryman and Oro Grande, he appeared to get the train back under control, reducing to schedule speed of 60 miles per hour. 2 minutes after passing Oro Grande, the Transcon derailed on curve 28. Nobody ever determined which part of the 835 left the tracks first, the engine or the tender. Parker testified that he felt a lurch as the engine entered the curve, and then the driving wheels on the right side of the locomotive reared up and everything turned over to the left. Parker thought that he shoved the throttle all the way in and applied the train brakes in emergency, but he couldn't be certain. At any rate, it was too late by then. The 835 rolled over onto its left side and plowed up the eastbound main line for over 400 feet, probably hitting a rock outcropping on the opposite side of the right-of-way and coming to a stop at exactly milepost 34. The tender remained attached to the engine and performed exactly the same maneuver, rolling over to the left and plowing up the ballast. Parker grabbed wildly for something to hang on to as the engine rolled to the left, but he wasn't strong enough and he fell across the cab onto the fireman's seat box. At the same instant, a length of rail from the eastbound main, ripped from the roadbed by force of the derailment, slammed up through the cab of the locomotive, narrowly missing both engine men. Parker was badly dazed by his fall across the cab, but he wasn't rendered unconscious. Fireman Zettelmeyer did the best he could to ride it out, but was caught by the window frame. His left arm and leg were pinned under the frame by the plowed ballast. Parker tried to free him, but it was no use. Zettelmeyer was trapped. Fortunately for both men, there was no explosion, no fire, and no broken pipes venting superheated steam into the cab. As the engine and tender overturned, the first cars in line began to jackknife and telescope. The baggage car slewed across the main tracks and wedged itself against the rock walls on each side of the right-of-way, acting in effect as a dam or barrier protecting the locomotive from being rammed by the following cars. The first of the 3 lightweight coaches slammed into the baggage car and turned crosswise to the track also. Having nowhere to go, the next lightweight coach overrode the end of the first coach and slammed into the baggage car, rearing up and crumpling in the process. The third and last coach rammed the end of the second coach and jackknifed across the right-of-way, taking the first of the dining cars with it. The second diner took the balance of the derailment forces and was jackknifed as well. The fury of the derailment was subsided at that point. None of the 5 Pullman sleepers were derailed. All 6 fatalities occurred in the lounge areas of the first 2 lightweight coaches. 2 male passengers and an attendant died in the men's lounge at the front of the second coach, and 3 female passengers died in the ladies' lounge at the back of the first coach. Undoubtedly, the lounge areas were crushed when the ends of the cars overrode each other and then slammed into the baggage car. 3 hours of work with acetylene torches were necessary to remove the bodies from the wreckage. Parker climbed out of the cab between the roof and the tender frame and looked around for help. He was having a hard time focusing on where he was and what had happened. Conductor Murphy hurried up to the head end immediately after the wreck, looking for Parker and Zettelmeyer. Murphy assumed his head brakeman, George C. Mackenzie, had gone ahead to flag opposing trains coming from Victorville, if any. However, Mackenzie was just being helped out of the third coach as Murphy was working his way around the car. Murphy soon located Parker walking around the locomotive in a dazed condition, unable to explain what had happened. Murphy continued west along the tracks trying to get to a phone to report the accident. The accident site was not far from the main highway, US 66, and emergency responders became aware of the disaster very quickly. Murphy soon met a deputy sheriff coming the other way with an unnamed employee from the power plant that was near the main line. The plant employee told Murphy he had already called the Victorville depot and they were holding all trains. Murphy went to the power plant with the employee and checked in with the Victorville operator, who confirmed that ambulances and wrecking crews had already been called. By the time Murphy returned to the wreckage, the first switch engine from Victorville had arrived on the scene and rescue efforts were well underway. Volunteers worked with emergency responders to provide first aid to passengers trapped in the coaches. 7 members of the Victorville High School football team, led by 16-year-old Jerry Bowles, worked through the morning helping to extricate passengers from the coaches and manning stretchers for the injured. Rescue crews using heavy equipment eventually pulled fireman Zettelmeyer from the wreckage of the 835 also. Because the Victorville Army Air Base was very close to the accident site, first aid teams from the base were on the scene quickly. The shortage of hospitals in the Victorville area convinced railroad and Army officials to airlift the injured passengers from the base to Burbank Airport. 30 of the 32 injured passengers and crew were airlifted, including the most seriously injured passenger, who was the sole rider on a C-47 hospital plane. A convoy of ambulances was arranged on each end of the airlift. At Burbank, the injured passengers and crew members were taken to a number of hospitals in the area, but only 2 passengers required extensive treatment. Engineer Parker, Fireman Zettelmeyer, and head brakeman Mackenzie were among the airlifted victims, being taken to Good Samaritan Hospital in Los Angeles. Parker was released after being treated for cuts and bruises. Mackenzie remained hospitalized for an unknown length of time, but eventually left town as soon as he was released. Zettelmeyer also sustained serious injuries in the accident, and his further treatment is unknown. No passengers or crew in the Pullman sleepers or diners were injured. Within a few hours of the accident, the sleepers were pulled back to Barstow, where the passengers were transferred to buses for the run into Los Angeles. ATSF and UP crews worked from both ends of the wreckage throughout the day to re-rail and remove the cars from the site. The wreckage was cleared and the tracks reopened to traffic at 8:00 p.m. the next day, Friday, September 27th. The 835 and its tender were placed on heavy-duty flat cars and moved to UP's locomotive shops at East Los Angeles, where they were rebuilt and returned to service late in the year. The fate of the coaches and diners is unknown. A joint hearing and investigation into the cause of the accident was conducted by ATSF and UP officials in Los Angeles on October 3rd through 5th, 1946. The investigation was held jointly with representatives from the California Railroad Commission and the Interstate Commerce Commission. Labor organizations representing the UP employees summoned to the investigation participated in the hearing also. Parker, Murphy, and Roy gave extensive testimony at the hearing. Zettelmeyer refused to attend or give a statement. He instead hired an attorney to represent him in his FELA action against the UP. It is not known if he ever returned to work for the railroad. Mackenzie also refused to attend the hearing for unknown reasons. It is rumored that he resigned from the UP shortly after the accident and took his retirement. Extensive testimony was given at the hearing by UP's Newhart and General Mechanical Engineer Frank J. Jumper on the issue of the overturning speed of the 835 on Curve 28. Jumper testified that in order to determine the overturning speed, it was first necessary to find the center of gravity of the locomotive and of the tender based on amount of oil and water remaining. Tests were made on another 800 class locomotive immediately after the accident to determine the level of the oil and water that would remain at Curve 28. Based on these tests, Jumper said that the center of gravity of the locomotive was 78 inches above top of rail, and for the tender, 78 inches. Given the above centers of gravity and using a 6-degree 3-foot curve having a super elevation of 3 inches, Jumper calculated that the locomotive would overturn at 76.8 miles per hour and the tender at 78.1 miles per hour. These speeds were determined by application of standard formulae adopted by the American Railway Engineering Association. The maximum safe speed of Curve 28 was calculated to be 48.2 miles per hour under the same formula. Jumper was certain that an 800 class locomotive and tender could negotiate Curve 28 safely at 40 miles per hour. UP Division Engineer J.P. Mack also testified that Curve 28 would ride fine at 40 miles per hour and that the maximum safe speed would be 48 miles per hour. He disagreed with setting the speed restriction at 40 miles per hour though, saying that UP would hold the speed to 35 miles per hour in a curve with these characteristics. This would be 90% of the so-called comfortable speed as determined under area standards, which was 40 miles per hour. He had no jurisdiction over the engineering on the joint line, however, and was forced to defer to Santa Fe's judgment on the matter of speeds. Parker was steadfast in his testimony that he did not exceed the speed restriction of 40 miles per hour through Curve 28. He could not explain why the locomotive and tender derailed in Curve 28. Santa Fe and Union Pacific officials who arrived first at the scene testified that they found the 835's throttle in the 4 3/4 extended position and the brake handles in running or release position. Murphy also testified that he did not believe the train was exceeding the speed limit as it approached Curve 28, adding that his attention was diverted by having to perform ticket duties for some of the Pullman passengers just prior to the accident. Roy was in a tough spot since his flagman's report clearly showed that Parker was speeding. He had to admit that his numbers showed that Parker was over the limit. The only humorous moment in the investigation came during the testimony of UP dining car steward John A. Courtney, who was in charge of the forward dining car on the morning of the wreck. Courtney was new to the railroad business, having been on the job for about a year. He did not understand the process of a railroad investigation, where all representatives, company, union, and government are entitled to ask questions and therefore usually ask the same ones 3 or 4 times. His testimony was supposed to verify the time of the derailment, which would help establish whether Parker was speeding. Courtney was a very precise dining car steward. He always made his first call to breakfast at exactly 7 o'clock a.m., he testified. He had a special Elgin Railroad watch, and he always compared time with the conductor and checked with the radio when at home. He was certain that the wreck happened within 3 or 4 minutes after 7 o'clock. Since this didn't quite square with Roy's numbers, everybody tried to get Courtney to admit that he was wrong, but he wasn't having any of it. He was adamant that he began seating people just after 7 and had seated 10 or so when the wreck happened. He didn't notice anything wrong about the speed of the train or the way the dining car rode before the accident. He said he was surprised at how fast the train stopped. Finally, he was asked about the timing of his first call to breakfast one too many times and lost his temper. "Why, I said about 9 times I imagined that I make a call every morning at 7 o'clock. Do I speak English clearly or what is wrong? It could be nothing else. It would have to be after 7 o'clock, wouldn't it? I thought I made that clear about 9 times. Courtney also made it clear he was leaving the Union Pacific post-haste. "Is this the first derailment of this nature you have been involved in?" "First and last, unless they have one pretty quick." On November 7th, 1946, the Interstate Commerce Commission issued its report finding that the cause of the accident was excessive speed in Curve 28. The ICC determined that the 835 exceeded its overturning speed while negotiating this curve. Parker had already been terminated by UP on October 6, 1946, after being found responsible by the ATSF officials for the derailment of the Transcon due to excessive speed in Curve 28. It is unknown if he ever returned to work for the UP, but it seems doubtful. The record does not disclose if Murphy and Roy were also found responsible for the derailment. It is likely they continued to be employed by UP until retirement. The 835 was rebuilt by UP's locomotive forces at the East Los Angeles shops and was returned to passenger service either at the end of 1946 or the beginning of 1947. The 835 remained on the active roster until the end of the steam era in the late 1950s, at which time it was retired and scrapped. The Transcon itself did not fare so well either. By February of the following year, the train was gone, its reputation ruined by the wreck. The Los Angeles Limited took over the through New York sleepers at that time. The material in this article was drawn from the transcript of the joint investigation into the accident, the exhibits of thereto, and various newspaper clippings. The author wishes to thank Jim 80 of Salt Lake City for supplying the newspaper clippings and additional photographs. The story of this wreck comes from the official publication of the Union Pacific Historical Society, Volume 20, Number 4, The Streamliner, Fall 2006.